Hello everybody, this is Refresh and I am here to talk to you about the Bloomburrow Prerelease that I attended this past weekend. This is perhaps one of the most unique sets for Magic the Gathering that we have yet seen because it's set in a world that is entirely filled with anthropomorphic woodland animals, and the primary inspiration for this is probably going to be Redwall, but I never read that book or any of the parts of its series, so I don't really know much about it other than the basic idea that it's about anthropomorphic animals living in a fantasy-ish kind of world. But I did read a bit of Mouse Guard, which was inspired by it, and that's a comic book, and then we also have some board games that are similarly inspired by that, like Mice and Mystics and Root. And so that sort of drove my interest in Bloomburrow in particular, because, I mean, who doesn't like cute little animals doing fantasy things? In terms of its story, I read all of the stories that were posted on Wizards' main website, and I thought that it was fine. It was nice and lighthearted. It doesn't have any of the intensity of a lot of the sets as of late, and so it's nice to get away, meet a whole cast of predominantly new characters, and explore this world. Unlike Outlaws of Thunder Junction, where we didn't really get to explore the world, we just met a whole lot of recurring characters, and that I think was not a great use of its new plane and theme. And so Bloomburrow had a lot of promise in its setting, and I think that it paid off in the way that it was presented. This is the pre-release kit that came with the set. We have a lovely art on the outside here, and then we open it up and it says, "The lush wilderness of Bloomburrow is home to tall tales and tiny heroes. Wielding spell and steel, a brave band of animals sets out to uncover the secrets of the valley. Adventure awaits behind every leaf." And then, as usual, you have some counters and tokens that you can punch out of the box. And the box is art all the way into the inside here, so that's nice. We didn't need any of these during my game, so I left them in the box. Then we have our deck box here with a repeat of the art from the outside. If you open it up, you get one spin down life counter using the black with color theme. You'll get your promo card. I got a Salvation Swan here, and then you also get a code for Magic the Gathering Arena. I've already inputted this particular code, so there's no need for you to try to do this again, but I might have more codes in the future, and if I do, you are free to use those codes as well. And then you also have a building a pre-release deck fold out, which gives you the basics of how to build a pre-release deck. They put the same one in every single set, and this I think would probably fit for this particular set as well. And then on the other side, we have a little bit of flavor art and a little bit of information about the different types of animal folk that you'll encounter in the set. Every little bit helps to add to the flavor of the set. You get a card divider with a repeat of this same artwork here. And then you get 6 packs of Magic the Gathering. Nothing special, nothing additional. This set is pretty bare bones in terms of what they're offering for the pre-release to help you feel the set, but the cards go a long way, and as you can see, the artwork is quite lovely. So opening up my 6 packs, this is all the playable cards that I opened, in addition to some very lovely basic lands that are full art, and so this is definitely a wonderful reason to pick up some packs of the set, or at least look into picking up some of the lands, because the artwork is quite lovely. But this is everything that I opened, including my promo card, which is the Salvation Swan right there. As you can see, just looking at the stacks of cards here, black was the thickest in terms of the number of cards that are in it, followed by green, and then white and blue tied, followed by red at the bottom. I also opened up more rares than average, and so we even have a mythic over here in the Eluge, the Shoreless Sea, and then 2 legendary creatures in Camellia, the Seed Miser, and Clement, the Worrywart. I was very much inclined to play black to begin with because it had a lot of removal and just a large selection of cards. And then that meant that I was primarily looking to play a color combination that played well with black in my pool. That immediately had me looking at blue because of Clement, green because of Camellia, and I could easily put red out of commission because it just didn't have a lot of power, nor did it have a lot of cards to work with. So the first thing I looked at was blue because I had that mythic in Eluge the Shoreless Sea, as well as a couple other rares in the Wishing Well and the Mockingbird, which made me think that it could be a potentially strong combination, and that would also open up the door to play the Mind Drill Assistant, for example. And after looking at it, I found that Eluge was not very good in a non-mono blue deck anyways, because of the 3 blues in the casting cost and the need to turn everything into islands to power out its ability. And then a lot of my blue spells in general leaned a little bit more into a blue-red spells theme, and that wasn't as good for the rest of the card pool that I had. Like, I would have to play it with red, and that would be putting 2 very shallow card pools together, and ultimately that led me off of blue. And I could have looked at white. I mean, white had some decent cards in it as well, but I was really keen to play with green, and that's because I had Camellia the Seed Miser here, and not an amazing number of squirrels, but a good number of squirrels, including the Corpseberry Cultivator, and some potential synergies with food there. One thing about the set that I did appreciate is also that they added these hybrid mana cards as well, so you could potentially stick some of those in to help shore up your deck. And I could have potentially splashed one of these other colors, but I found ultimately that the splash was kind of unnecessary because the core synergies here work so well, and I didn't really need to muck it up with additional cards from another color, even though I did have the 2 Uncharted Havens and the Hidden Grotto to help me splash. So this is the final deck list. There was a focus on Camellia, the Seed Miser, so I wanted to make sure that I had a good amount of squirrels in here. And I put in some food cards as well that would work well with it, so that's why the Paw Patch formation is here. It's mostly to draw a card and get the food. I like Savor a lot because it also creates a food. And the Bone Catch Overseer will give you a little bit of bonus for foraging, as well as Corpseberry Cultivator. And so there's that, and then a few other squirrels to benefit from the counters that Camellia will be putting down. On the spell side, I pretty much stuck to primarily removal spells, and so I have removal spells on all the different levels here. And then we have the Hunter's Talent, which gets you a little bit more than the removal spell in giving your creature trample and eventually drawing you cards. I missed a whole bunch of those triggers during the game, by the way, so I have to remember when you have these, you're going to get the trigger to draw a card. Don't forget to draw the card, because I missed a lot of them and probably lost because of it. And then we have 2 other cards that are not removal spells, which are the Sinister Monolith, which is a type of card draw. It also drains while it's on the battlefield, so you can just play it, drain some life, and eventually when it's time to use it to draw cards, then you can sacrifice it to draw cards and pay 2 life. And then we have Hazel's Nocturne, and because I'm going to be milling a little bit in this deck, then Hazel's Nocturne will work to get some of the creatures that I milled, as well as dealing a little bit of damage, draining a little, giving me a little bit of reach. And that's what the Glide Dive Duo is also doing. The flying, I don't have a lot of ways of getting through if it weren't for that, aside from Camellia giving menace to some of my creatures, and so that also gets me a little bit of reach in the air, and the drain helps to finish off or get me further towards my end. Obviously we have my other bomb in the Keen-Eyed Curator here, and this has the ability to exile cards from my graveyards to feed itself, and so this is kind of competing with the Forged sub-theme here, but I think it's okay. What I had to not put in this deck was Mind Drill, the Dimir creature that has Threshold, because the Forge mechanic actually works against Threshold, so you don't really want to have both in a particular deck. And so that didn't make the deck for that particular reason. It's not a high power deck aside from the Keen-Eyed Curator, and if I can get Camellia going, and then those 2 cards can probably do a lot. Fortunately, I have a good amount of removal, so I'll be using the removal to take out my opponent's threats and then hopefully give me enough long games so I can get out the Keen-Eyed Curator or Camellia. Fortunately, I have a good amount of removal, so I'll be using the removal to take out my opponent's threats and then hopefully give me enough long games so I can get out the Keen-Eyed Curator. Next, we'll talk about the games. So now let's talk about the matches. Emerald Knights does a 3-match sealed tournament with a flat prize structure, so everybody gets 2 packs at the end of the tournament, as long as you play through all 3 games. And so that takes a little bit of the stress out of playing a tournament, because you're going to get your reward no matter what. And in my first match, I was put up against a blue, black, and red player. Although in the first game, it took a while for the red cards to come out, and so I didn't realize that that was happening. The first game was a bit of a stalemate for a while. We held the boards relatively even together, but my opponent had flyers, and so they were chipping away at me for 3 damage a turn. And I flooded really hard. Even though I was able to hold the ground down, I just could not draw enough removal to deal with my opponent's flyers, and then that took me out in the end. And I actually drew every single land in my deck with 10 cards still left in the deck, as I found out when I played my frog that searches for lands. I actually searched for lands, there were none left, and so I actually managed to draw every single land in my deck with 10 cards still left in the deck. And when you flood that hard, you lose at Magic the Gathering. We went on to the second game with me on the play again this time, and this time I won, primarily off the power of my Keen-Eyed Collector, which is one of the strongest cards in my deck. Probably the strongest card in my deck. It does play for double green, but it can pack quite the wallop, and it actually neutralized a lot of the threshold stuff that my opponent was trying to do. And so that just got in early, and it was hard for my opponent to deal with that, especially when I removed their blockers and just took them down very quickly. My opponent got their revenge in the third match. They were on the play this time, and they played a creature that was kind of like a Dark Apprentice. It's the creature that can create an offspring, and what it does every turn is on your upkeep, you reveal the top card of your deck, take damage equal to its mana cost, and then draw that card. And my opponent got a crazy strong draw engine going, and I mistakenly removed one but not the other of the 2 creatures, and I think that that was my undoing, because my opponent eventually buried me in card damage. They were losing a lot of life to their offspring card that was drawing them cards, but they also were able to bounce that card out of their existence, so they didn't have to worry about it killing them. And eventually the card advantage overran me pretty hard, especially after they cast Ral as a planeswalker. The value was just too hard for me to handle, and I was overrun and lost pretty quickly there, losing the first match 1-2. On to the second match. This was against a black-red player, and the very first game, my opponent had been able to whittle down my life quite a bit, but I was able to stabilize with a decent board for a while, and then my opponent played the Sunspy and Lynx, which causes damage equal to the number of non-basic lands they control. And then because I didn't read this properly, we just assumed that it said basic lands, and so it did 8 damage to me and 8 damage to him, and I died. But that was, in retrospect, a misreading, and I didn't understand that till literally just now, looking back at my notes and looking back at the actual card and what it does. And so that was a bit of a mistake on both of our parts, reading incorrectly what this creature did. But I gave him the win, and I didn't read the card well enough, and that was my fault. We moved on to the second game. In this second game, I had the lead. I was able to remove my opponent's threats and take my opponent down to a fairly low life total, and by the time that they were able to stabilize, they were so far behind that I think they just wanted to move on to the next game, and so they conceded that one and moved on to the next game. The final match, my opponent just flooded hard, and unfortunately because of that, they were not able to maintain much of a board, and they were really salty afterwards, so they didn't let me take a picture of the final game state. So all I had for you is an empty board on their side. But as you can see, I had built up quite the board with squirrels getting stronger and everything. And so my opponent left at that. They also mulliganed down to 6, and so that didn't help them at all with that particular situation. And so I won the second match 2-1, and then with a 1-1 record, moved into the third match. My final match was up against a blue, red, and green player. This one, I did not realize that they had green in their deck at all for most of the first game, and then they finally played their green cards. They won the first match off of a 1-1 unblockable creature that gave them loot, and then when it hits threshold, lets them draw a card, and they were able to put a Mockingbird to duplicate that, and so those two were hitting me every turn and giving them a tremendous amount of card advantage. And even though I was able to assemble the Squirrel combo with Camellia, that just was not enough to overcome the tremendous card advantage that they had, and they just buried me very quickly. In the second match, my opponent unfortunately had to mulligan down to 5, and this really hurt them because I was able to just kill some of their creatures and then overrun them with my creatures, and they just could not keep up because they couldn't get enough cards back in time. That was me on the play. Now for the third game, my opponent was on the play, and then they again had to mulligan down to 5, which was unfortunate, and then on top of that, they were color screwed to begin with, and then they just ended up flooding, but not into the colors that they could play. And so that wasn't really much of a contested game, and I took the win in that one, although that was a sad win, and ended up going 2-1 over the course of the entire tournament. How do I feel about Bloomburrow as a set? Well, the sealed decks, I would say, played pretty slowly. Every single one went down to the wire in terms of going down to the third game. And in my first match, we actually went to turns because we ran out of time, but I saw that my opponent would have defeated me eventually, and so I gave them the game. But even though it's a little bit of a slog at times, because the board states get pretty big, the creatures aren't that large, and so you're not having huge swings. The removal is relatively good, and I like the synergies between the cards, and it doesn't feel like a tribal set in the way that Ixalan felt like a tribal set. And so it doesn't feel too linear. There are things that the color pairs are trying to do, and there are some synergies and anti-synergies between them that I think are good to be aware of. But overall, I found that the set was fairly enjoyable in sealed. I think it will be better in draft when you can lean a little bit more heavily into the card synergies. And then, of course, I like the theming. It's very cute, and the cards are fairly easy to understand versus some of the sets that we've been previously playing. And so this one is a little bit more easier to grok, and consequently probably an easier one to introduce people to if they want to learn to play Magic. The pre-release itself was admittedly a little disappointing in the fact that there was nothing really added to the experience to help you feel a little bit more of the set. Like, it's really relying on its art and its mechanics as usual for most Wizards pre-releases, but sometimes they add a little something to make this one better. One thing that I did note about the pre-release experience is that there are a lot of tokens needed, and there are not a lot of tokens offered in the packs. Like, you're not guaranteed a token in the pack. Consequently, we couldn't even find tokens across an entire table of players to help mitigate some of the tokens that we needed at times. And so one of the things I think Wizards would be wise to do is to either put a full set of tokens in each pre-release kit for all the different offspring and other things that you can find, or give the store a stack of tokens that they can hand out to the players as much as they need in order to be able to play and have representative tokens on the board. Because a lot of times we were just using, cards flipped down or other unmarked tokens, and those can get confusing at times. What's a food, what's a treasure, what's an offspring creature. And I think that would have helped a lot in terms of the playability of the games in this particular format. For their part, Emerald Knights offered the 2 packs that you get for participating throughout the entire tournament, so I got to take that home. And that was it for their part 2, so there isn't much in terms of the theme or the play experience to Bloomburrow. And I think that drags down the overall pre-release experience because it's a little bit of grindy, the games are long, and they're not terribly explosive. Yes, it is a lovely set to look at, and the gameplay can be interesting, but because it wasn't anything to really attach me to the theme, and sealed gameplay, I feel, since in the era of play boosters, have gotten a little bit uneven thanks to the potential for a high number of rares for some people and then a lower number of rares for others, that I don't know that it is as good as the draft experience. And so overall, I think that Bloomburrow, the pre-release experience, is going to be really on the average side of things, maybe a little on the lower average side of things, while I would say that the set itself looks like it's going to be a lot more fun once you're going to draft it or play some sort of Bloomburrow constructed or anything like that. And so those are my thoughts regarding my experience with my Bloomburrow pre-release. If you went to your pre-release, let me know how it went for you and your thoughts on it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more of my videos, you can subscribe. This is Refresh. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.